Sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen when nobody's watching, and the deepest healing comes from the most unexpected hands. In 1880s Wyoming, broken dreams and forgotten promises drift like tumbleweeds across the endless plains. But one weathered cowboy named Dusty Hayes is about to discover that redemption doesn't have an expiration date. When he finds young Henry Calloway, a paralyzed boy hidden away by his wealthy mother's shame, Dusty sees something familiar in those distant eyes. Against all rules, he lifts the boy onto his gentlest horse and teaches him to ride with steady hands and patient words. What they don't know is that Henry's cold, distant mother Margaret watches from her mansion window, tears streaming down her face as she sees her son laugh for the first time in years. But what happens when three broken souls collide under the vast Wyoming sky? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Wyoming plains as Elias Dusty Hayes stepped out of his weathered cabin, the floorboards creaking under boots that had walked more miles than most men could count. At 58, his hands bore the permanent stains of leather and horse sweat, and his back carried the weight of 30 years, breaking wild mustangs and wilder memories. The Civil War had ended decades ago, but some battles never truly cease. They just move from battlefields to the quiet spaces of a man's heart. His daily ritual began before dawn, same as it had for the past 5 years since he'd settled on the edge of the Calloway estate. Coffee black as tar, 2 pieces of hardtack, and a long look at the horizon that stretched endlessly toward the mountains. The Calloway mansion sat like a fortress on the hill above, its white columns and manicured gardens a stark contrast to his one-room shack with its sagging roof and patched walls. Money couldn't buy everything, Dusty knew, but it sure could build walls high enough to keep the world at bay. The horses were waiting in the corral, their breath steaming in the cool morning air. These weren't the wild ones that had made his reputation throughout the territory. Those days were behind him now. These were gentler creatures, horses bred for riding rather than survival, but each one still required his patient touch and understanding voice. Whisper, his favorite mare, nickered softly as he approached, her grey coat dappled with white patches that reminded him of clouds against a summer sky. "Morning, girl," he murmured, running his weathered hand along her neck. "Ready for another day of teaching these youngsters some manners?" The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, training horses for a family he'd never properly met, living on land that belonged to people who probably didn't even know his full name. The arrangement suited him fine. He got his solitude. They got their horses trained, and everyone minded their own business. That's how it had been since Margaret Calloway's husband died 3 years back, leaving her with more land than she knew what to do with, and a grief so heavy it seemed to settle over the entire estate like morning fog. He'd seen her exactly twice in all those years. Once at her husband's funeral, standing rigid as a fence post while the preacher spoke about eternal rest and God's plan. The second time had been from a distance, a figure in black moving through her garden, like a ghost haunting its own grave. The townspeople spoke of her in hushed tones, how she'd shut herself away, how she never came to church anymore, how the boy had been injured in some terrible accident that left him unable to walk. The boy, Henry Calloway, 10 years old according to the gossip at Murphy's General Store, though Dusty had never laid eyes on him. Some said he was delicate, others claimed he was simple-minded, but the truth was probably simpler than the rumors, just a child dealing with more pain than any young soul should have to carry. As Dusty worked with the horses, teaching a stubborn gelding to accept the bit without fighting, he found his gaze drifting toward the mansion's upper windows. Sometimes he caught glimpses of movement behind the curtains, shadows that might have been people or might have been his imagination. The house felt lived in but not alive, if such a thing made sense, like a heart that was still beating but had forgotten how to feel. His own heart knew something about that particular ailment. The war had taken his son, though not in the way most would expect. Thomas hadn't died on a battlefield. He'd been killed in a riding accident just 2 months before the war ended, thrown from a spooked horse while carrying messages between camps. Dusty had been leading a cavalry charge against Confederate positions when it happened, too far away to help, too late to say goodbye. The irony of a cavalry officer's son dying from a fall had been lost on no one, least of all Dusty himself. That's when the drinking started, when the nightmares began bleeding into his waking hours. That's when he'd realized that some wounds never heal, they just learn to live quietly inside you, like old bullets that doctors leave in place because removing them would cause more damage than letting them stay. He'd tried marriage again after the war, a good woman named Sarah who'd loved him despite his ghosts. But loving a broken man is like trying to hold water in cupped hands eventually. It all leaks through. She'd left on a Tuesday morning in spring, taking her patience and her hope with her, leaving only a note that said she couldn't compete with dead memories. Now, at 58, Dusty had made peace with solitude. His horses understood him better than people ever had, and the wide Wyoming sky didn't judge a man for his past mistakes. This arrangement with the Calloway estate provided enough money for his simple needs and enough isolation to keep his demons quiet. The mansion's governess, Miss Catherine Morse, came by every few weeks to check on the horses and deliver his modest pay. She was a stern woman in her 40s, efficient and proper, with the kind of demeanor that suggested she'd seen enough of life's disappointments to armor herself against any more. She spoke of her charges in careful, measured tones. Mrs. Calloway was managing well under the circumstances, and young Master Henry was adjusting to his limitations with remarkable fortitude. Dusty had learned to read between the lines of such careful language. The boy was struggling, the mother was drowning in grief, and Miss Catherine was probably the only thing holding that broken household together. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't put his finger on why. The air carried a restlessness that made the horses skittish, and even Whisper seemed to be watching the mansion with unusual interest. As he led her through her paces, working on her gait and responsiveness, he found himself wondering about the people living behind those pristine white walls. What kind of man had James Calloway been? The townspeople remembered him as fair and generous, a rancher who'd treated his workers with respect and his family with devotion. He'd built the estate from nothing, they said, starting with a small spread and expanding it through hard work and smart decisions. He'd been the kind of man other men looked up to, the kind who left big shoes to fill. And what of the boy? What was it like to go from running free across these same plains to being confined to a wheelchair, dependent on others for everything? Dusty had seen enough injured soldiers to know that the spirit could be harder to heal than the body, especially in someone so young. As for Margaret Calloway, she remained an enigma wrapped in widow's weeds and locked behind mansion doors. Beautiful, according to those who remembered her before tragedy struck. Intelligent and spirited, the kind of woman who could match her husband's ambitions with her own strength. Now she was just another casualty of life's cruel arithmetic, subtracted from the world by circumstances beyond anyone's control. The sun climbed higher, warming the air and bringing out the scent of sage and wildflowers. Dusty worked through his morning routine, checking on each horse, cleaning the stalls, mending a section of fence that had been loosened by the wind. Simple, honest work that kept his hands busy and his mind focused on the present instead of wandering back to darker times. It was during his afternoon break, while he sat on his porch, whittling a piece of pine and watching the horses graze, that he first saw the boy. A flash of movement in an upper window of the mansion caught his eye. There, pressed against the glass, was a small face framed by dark hair. Even at this distance, Dusty could see the intensity of the child's gaze as he watched the horses in the corral. The boy's hands were pressed flat against the window, and something about his posture, the longing, the desperate hunger in the way he leaned forward, struck Dusty like a physical blow. He'd seen that look before, in his own son's eyes whenever they'd passed a particularly fine horse. It was the look of someone who understood that horses weren't just animals, but partners, companions, extensions of the human spirit that could carry you beyond the limitations of your earthly body. The moment stretched between them across the distance, man and boy connected by their shared understanding of what it meant to love horses. Then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, Henry was gone from the window, leaving Dusty to wonder if he'd imagined the entire encounter. But the image stayed with him through the rest of the day, through his evening meal of beans and cornbread, through the lonely hours before sleep when the silence of his cabin seemed to press against his ears like cotton. That look of longing, that desperate hunger for something that had been taken away, he understood it better than the boy could possibly know. That night, as he lay on his narrow bed listening to the wind whistle through the gaps in his walls, Dusty Hayes made a decision that would change 3 lives forever. He didn't know it yet, couldn't see the chain of events that would unfold from one moment of human compassion, but somewhere deep in his war-scarred heart, he felt the stirring of something he'd thought was long dead. Hope, perhaps. Or maybe just the recognition that some wounds can only heal when we stop trying to heal them alone. In the mansion on the hill, Margaret Calloway sat by her son's bedside, reading from a book of poetry that neither of them particularly enjoyed. Henry's wooden toy horse, a carved Mustang his father had made, before the accident sat on the bedside table, gathering dust, like so many other reminders of what used to be. Outside their window, the same moon that shone on Dusty's cabin cast silver light across the corral, where tomorrow would bring an encounter that none of them expected. But tonight, they were still strangers, still trapped in their separate prisons of grief and limitation and stubborn solitude. Tomorrow would be the day when a weathered cowboy decided that some rules were meant to be broken, especially when breaking them might help a boy remember how to dream again. The next morning brought clouds heavy with the promise of rain, the kind of weather that made horses restless and old war wounds ache. Dusty had risen earlier than usual, driven by a restlessness he couldn't name, and was already working with a young stallion when he noticed the commotion near the mansion's side garden. Miss Catherine Morse was walking briskly toward the main house, her usual composed demeanor replaced by obvious agitation. Behind her, sitting alone in his wheeled chair beside the garden gate, was the boy Dusty had glimpsed in the window the day before. Henry Calloway was smaller than Dusty had expected, his legs thin beneath a wool blanket, but his posture held a dignity that spoke of inner strength. Dark hair fell across his forehead, and even from this distance, Dusty could see the intelligence burning in his eyes as he watched the horses with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Miss Catherine had clearly intended to wheel the boy back inside, but something had called her away, perhaps Mrs. Calloway needing assistance or some household crisis requiring immediate attention. Whatever the reason, she'd left Henry sitting alone, positioned perfectly to watch the corral where Dusty worked with the horses. The boy's hands gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles white with the effort of leaning forward. He was close enough now that Dusty could see the naked longing on his face, the way his eyes tracked every movement of the horses with the devotion of someone who understood their grace and power in ways that most people never would. Dusty found himself walking toward the fence line before he'd consciously decided to move. The stallion he'd been training followed behind him, curious about this change in routine. When Dusty reached the fence closest to where Henry sat, he could see the boy's breath catching, could see the way his entire body seemed to strain toward the horses, as if willpower alone might lift him from his chair. "You like horses?" Dusty said quietly, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the boy's ears. Henry startled, as if he'd been caught doing something forbidden. His cheeks flushed, but he didn't look away from the stallion that stood beside Dusty, its coat gleaming like burnished copper in the morning light. "I used to ride," Henry said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Before." The single word carried the weight of a world that had been lost, dreams that had been shattered, a life that had been divided into before and after by forces beyond a child's control. Dusty recognized the tone. He'd heard it in his own voice often enough. "What was your horse's name?" Dusty asked, leaning against the fence rail in a way that brought him closer to the boy's level. "Thunder." Henry's voice grew stronger, animated by memory. He was black with white markings on his face, like lightning. "Papa said he was the fastest horse in 3 counties. The boy's expression darkened. "Papa said a lot of things." The bitterness in those last words cut deep. Dusty had heard similar sentiments from soldiers who'd lost faith in everything they'd once believed, men who'd seen too much death and disappointment to trust in promises anymore. "Your papa was right about something, though," Dusty said, gesturing toward the horses in the corral. "A good horse can carry you places that your legs alone never could. Thunder taught you that, didn't he?" Henry's eyes filled with tears that he fought to keep from falling. "Thunder's dead, died in the same accident that—" He gestured at his useless legs. "The doctors say I'll never ride again. They say my back is too damaged, that I'll never walk, never run, never do anything normal boys do." "Do?" Dusty studied the boy's face, seeing past the tears to the fierce intelligence beneath. This wasn't a child who'd given up. This was someone who'd been told to give up, who'd been surrounded by well-meaning adults, convinced that protection meant limitation. "Doctors know a lot about broken bones," Dusty said slowly. "They don't know much about broken spirits, and they sure don't understand what's possible when a horse decides to help heal both." Henry's head snapped up, hope flickering in his eyes like a candle flame in a drafty room. "What do you mean?" Dusty glanced toward the mansion, making sure Miss Catherine was still occupied inside. What he was about to suggest went against every rule of propriety, every boundary between his world and the Calloway's. But the look on Henry's face, that desperate hunger for something more than the careful limitations that had been imposed on his life, reminded him too powerfully of his own son's dreams. "I mean," Dusty said quietly, "that there are different ways to ride a horse, different kinds of saddles, different ways of staying connected that don't require perfect legs or a perfect back. You think," Henry's voice broke with emotion, "you think I could really ride again?" The question hung between them like a bridge that could either support the weight of new possibility or collapse under the burden of false hope. Dusty thought of his son Thomas, of all the rides they'd never taken together, all the lessons that had been cut short by war and accident, and the cruel mathematics of loss. "I think," Dusty said carefully, "that you won't know what's possible until you try. And I think Thunder taught you things that didn't die with him, things about balance and trust, and the way a horse's movement can become part of your own body." Henry was crying openly now, tears streaming down his cheeks, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Miss Catherine would never allow it. Mama would—" He stopped, his expression closing off like a door slamming shut. "Mama doesn't talk to me about horses anymore. She doesn't talk to me about much of anything." The pain in those words was so raw that Dusty felt it like a physical blow. Here was a boy who'd lost not just his ability to walk, but his connection to his mother, his place in the world, his sense of who he was meant to become. "Sometimes," Dusty said gently, "grown-ups get so scared of losing what's left that they forget to help us find what's still possible." He made a decision that surprised him with its suddenness. "If you want to try, just try, mind you. Nothing dangerous I could teach you. We'd have to be careful, and we'd have to keep it between us until we know it's safe. But if you want to see if riding is still possible for you, I'm willing to find out alongside you." Henry's eyes went wide. "You would do that? For me?" "I would do that for any boy who loved horses the way you do," Dusty said, and realized as he spoke that it was the truth. "But especially for one who reminds me that some dreams are too important to abandon just because they get harder to reach." The boy wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, leaving streaks on his pale cheeks. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, early, before Miss Catherine comes to get you for your lessons. Can you get yourself out here without help?" Henry nodded eagerly. "I can manage the chair on the garden paths. I've been practicing when no one's watching." "Good boy." Dusty smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. We'll start with Whisper. She's gentle as a lamb and steady as bedrock. We'll take it slow. See how you feel. Make sure everything's safe before we try anything more. And if it works, if I can really ride again?" Dusty looked at the hope shining in Henry's eyes and felt something shift inside his own chest, like ice beginning to crack and flow again after a long, hard winter. "If it works, then we'll figure out what comes next, one day at a time, one ride at a time." Neither of them noticed the figure watching from an upstairs window, a woman in black who'd come to close the curtains against the threatening storm, and instead found herself witnessing a conversation that would change everything she thought she knew about her son's limitations. Margaret Calloway's hand pressed against the glass as she watched her boy's face transform with something she hadn't seen there in 2 long years: hope. And for the first time since the accident that had stolen so much from all of them, she found herself wondering if the doctors might have been wrong about more than just her son's legs. Below in the garden, Dusty was already walking back toward the corral, leaving Henry to contemplate the impossible possibility that tomorrow might bring something other than another day of careful limitations and whispered sympathies. The boy sat in his chair, watching the horses until Miss Catherine returned to wheel him inside, and if she noticed the new light in his eyes, she was wise enough not to ask questions that might extinguish it. Dawn came cold and grey, the promised storm having passed in the night, leaving the air crisp and clean. Dusty had been awake for an hour, his stomach tight with nerves he hadn't felt since his first cavalry charge. What he was about to attempt went against every instinct that had kept him alive through war and the dangerous work of breaking wild horses. Yet something deeper than instinct drove him forward: the memory of his son's face, the echo of dreams cut short, and the absolute certainty that some risks were worth taking. He'd spent the previous evening preparing, fashioning a modified saddle from leather straps and soft padding, creating supports that could help a boy with limited leg strength stay secure on horseback. Hidden in his war chest, beneath faded letters from home and his discharge papers, he'd found his old cavalry medal, tarnished now, but still bearing the inscription about valor and service. He'd forgotten he still had it, forgotten the pride he'd once felt wearing it. Now it felt like a weight in his pocket, a reminder of duties both completed and abandoned. Whisper stood patiently in the corral as Dusty checked and rechecked the modified tack. The mare seemed to sense the importance of what was about to happen, her usual playful nature replaced by an almost ceremonial calm. She'd always been his gentlest horse, the one he trusted with nervous riders and skittish children, but today would test even her remarkable patience. The sound of wheels on gravel announced Henry's arrival before Dusty saw him. The boy had managed to navigate his chair through the garden paths with remarkable skill, and when he appeared around the corner of the fence, his face was bright with excitement and determination. He'd dressed in his finest riding clothes, proper breeches, and a jacket that had probably belonged to his father, and his hair was combed with obvious care. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Dusty said honestly. "I wasn't sure either," Henry admitted, his hands trembling slightly as they gripped his chair's armrests. "But I dreamed about Thunder last night. He was running free across the meadow, and he looked back at me like he was waiting for something. When I woke up, I knew I had to try." Dusty felt his throat tighten. Dreams of the dead were familiar territory for him, but hearing a child speak of them with such matter-of-fact acceptance was both heartbreaking and inspiring. "Well then," Dusty said, walking over to Henry's chair, "let's see what's possible." The first challenge was simply getting Henry from his chair to the horse. Dusty had rigged a system of ropes and pulleys that would allow him to lift the boy safely. But even with Henry's cooperation, it was an awkward and delicate process. The boy's legs were thin and unresponsive, his back stiff from months of careful positioning, but his upper body had retained much of its strength. "Easy now," Dusty murmured, supporting Henry as they made the transfer. "Whisper's going to stand perfectly still. She understands this is important." The moment Henry settled into the modified saddle was one that Dusty would remember for the rest of his life. The boy's entire body seemed to transform, his spine straightening with remembered muscle memory, his hands finding their natural position on the reins, as if 2 years of absence had been merely a long pause rather than an ending. "Oh," Henry breathed, and the single word contained a universe of emotion. Tears ran down his cheeks, but his smile was radiant. "I remember this. I remember how it feels." Whisper remained perfectly still, as if she understood the significance of the moment. Dusty kept one hand on Henry's back, ready to steady him if needed, but the boy's seat was surprisingly secure. Whatever damage had been done to his legs, his core strength and balance remained intact. "How does it feel?" Dusty asked quietly. "Like coming home," Henry whispered. "Like I'm myself again." They stayed like that for long minutes, boy and horse, simply being together, remembering what it meant to be partners rather than patient and caregiver. Dusty watched Henry's face carefully, noting how the tension that had been his constant companion began to ease, how something fundamental seemed to settle back into place. "Can we walk?" Henry asked eventually. "Just a few steps?" Dusty nodded, taking Whisper's lead rope and guiding her forward at the slowest possible pace. Henry swayed slightly with the motion, but his hands remained steady on the reins, his body adapting to the familiar rhythm of the horse's movement. With each step, his confidence grew, his smile widened, and something that had been broken began to heal. They made a complete circuit of the small corral, Dusty walking alongside, ready to catch Henry if he slipped, but the boy never wavered. By the time they stopped, Henry was laughing, a sound of pure joy that seemed to echo across the empty plains and into the silent mansion beyond. "I can ride," Henry said, his voice filled with wonder. "I can actually ride." "You never stopped being a rider," Dusty corrected gently. "You just needed the right horse and the right saddle to remember what you already knew." As they prepared to end the session, Dusty was adamant about keeping these early attempts brief. Henry's expression grew serious. "Mr. Hayes," he said formally, "why are you doing this for me? You barely know me, and if Miss Catherine found out, or Mama, you could lose your position here." Dusty considered the question, thinking of his tarnished medal, his lost son, the long years of isolation and regret. "Because," he said finally, "sometimes helping someone else find what they've lost is the only way to find what you've lost yourself." Henry nodded as if he understood, though at 10 years old, he couldn't possibly grasp the full weight of what Dusty meant. But children often understood emotional truth, even when the specifics remained beyond them. The transfer back to Henry's chair was easier than the mounting had been, both of them having learned from the first attempt. As Dusty settled the boy back into his familiar position, Henry caught his sleeve. "Tomorrow?" he asked hopefully. "Tomorrow," Dusty promised. "And the day after that, if you want. We'll take it slow, build your strength and confidence gradually. No rushing, no taking chances that aren't worth taking." As Henry wheeled himself back toward the mansion, his movements seemed lighter somehow, as if the weight he'd been carrying had lessened. Dusty watched him go, then turned back to Whisper, running his hand along her neck in gratitude. "Good girl," he murmured. "You understood, didn't you? You knew what he needed." The mare nickered softly, and Dusty could have sworn she was agreeing with him. Animals often possessed wisdom that humans spent lifetimes trying to acquire, the knowledge that healing was a collaborative effort, that trust was the foundation of all real progress. As he unsaddled Whisper and put away the modified tack, Dusty felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. For the first time since the war, since losing Thomas, since Sarah's departure, he was doing something that mattered in ways that extended beyond his own narrow world. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Dusty pulled his old cavalry medal from his pocket. The tarnish couldn't hide the words etched into its surface, "For distinguished service." Perhaps, he thought, service took many forms, and the most important kind happened quietly between individuals who recognized in each other the possibility of healing. In the mansion, Henry sat by his window, his wooden toy horse in his hands, no longer a painful reminder of what he'd lost, but a promise of what might still be possible. And if anyone had been watching carefully, they might have noticed a figure in black standing at another window, her own eyes fixed on the corral, where tomorrow would bring another small miracle, another step toward something that medical science had declared impossible, but human will was determined to achieve. The secret lessons continued for 2 weeks, each dawn bringing new progress and deeper understanding between the unlikely pair. Henry's physical improvement was remarkable. His posture straightened, his arms grew stronger from gripping the reins and maintaining balance, and most importantly, the hollow look that had haunted his eyes began to fill with purpose and joy. Dusty had developed a routine that accommodated Henry's limitations while gradually expanding his capabilities. They started each session with simple mounting practice, then progressed to stationary exercises designed to improve the boy's seat and balance. Only when Henry felt completely secure did they attempt movement, and even then, Dusty never allowed Whisper to go faster than a slow walk. But it was the conversations that developed between them that marked the true beginning of healing for both. As Henry's confidence grew, so did his willingness to speak about the accident, about his father, about the isolation that had defined his world for the past 2 years. "Papa used to say that a horse could read your soul," Henry said one morning as they rested between exercises. He was seated on Whisper, his modified saddle allowing him to remain comfortably mounted while they talked. He said, "Thunder knew what I was thinking before I did. Your papa was a wise man," Dusty replied, checking the straps that secured Henry's legs. "Horses don't lie or pretend. They reflect what they sense in us, our fear, our confidence, our intentions." "What does Whisper see in me now?" Henry asked, leaning forward to stroke the mare's neck. Dusty observed the boy carefully, the straight line of his spine, the gentle confidence in his touch, the way Whisper's ears pricked forward in response to his voice. "She sees a rider," he said simply, "someone who belongs on horseback, who speaks her language." The smile that spread across Henry's face was like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. For the first time since the accident, someone had used the word rider to describe him, had seen him as something other than a victim of circumstance. Their sessions had not gone entirely unnoticed. Miss Catherine had begun asking pointed questions about Henry's improved mood and increased appetite. The boy's energy levels had risen dramatically, and he'd started requesting books about horses and riding techniques, interests that had been dormant since his accident. "Master Henry seems quite restored lately," Miss Catherine mentioned to Dusty one afternoon when she came to check on the horses. Her sharp eyes studied his face, as if searching for clues to some mystery. One might almost think he'd found a new source of inspiration. Dusty kept his expression neutral, but he could feel her suspicion like a weight on his shoulders. "Fresh air and sunshine can work wonders for anyone's spirits," he said carefully. "Indeed," Miss Catherine replied, but her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced by his explanation. More concerning was the attention they'd begun to attract from Jake Morrison, the ranch foreman who managed the Calloway estate's business affairs. Jake was a practical man in his 50s, loyal to the family, but suspicious of anything that might threaten their reputation or safety. He'd started making more frequent visits to the corral area, always with some official reason but clearly keeping watch. "You've been spending considerable time with the horses lately," Jake observed one morning, arriving just as Dusty was putting away the modified saddle. "Mrs. Calloway pays you to train them, not to play nursemaid." "The horses are well trained," Dusty replied evenly. "I take pride in my work. See that you remember where your duties lie," Jake said, his meaning clear. "This family has suffered enough disruption. They don't need any more complications." But the most significant change was happening in the mansion itself, though none of them spoke of it directly. Margaret Calloway had begun leaving her study more frequently, often appearing in rooms that offered views of the corral. She'd started wearing her wedding ring again. The simple gold band she'd removed after her husband's death now gleamed on her finger as she stood at windows, watching her son's mysterious transformation. Henry, for his part, had begun asking careful questions about his mother's absence from his daily life. The boy was intelligent enough to understand that grief could change people, but young enough to hope that change wasn't always permanent. "Does Mama ever ask about me?" he inquired one morning as Dusty helped him dismount after a particularly successful session. They'd managed several complete circuits of the corral, and Henry had even attempted a gentle trot, though only for a few seconds, and with Dusty running alongside. "I'm sure she thinks about you constantly," Dusty said, though he realized he had no actual knowledge of Margaret's thoughts or feelings. Sometimes when people lose something important, they get scared of losing what's left. It makes them careful in ways that might seem like they don't care, but really mean they care too much. Henry considered this with the seriousness that children bring to adult mysteries. "Papa used to say Mama was brave. He said she once rode through a thunderstorm to fetch the doctor when I had fever. But she seems scared of everything now. Fear and bravery aren't opposites," Dusty said, remembering his own struggles with both emotions. "Sometimes the bravest thing is admitting you're scared and doing what needs doing anyway." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of wheels on gravel. Henry needed to return to the mansion before Miss Catherine came looking for him. But as the boy maneuvered his chair toward the garden path, he paused. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "do you think Mama would be angry if she knew about our lessons?" Dusty thought of the figure he'd occasionally glimpsed at the mansion windows, the way she seemed to appear whenever Henry was at his happiest. "I think," he said carefully, "that your Mama wants what's best for you, even if she's not sure what that is right now." As Henry disappeared around the corner of the mansion, Dusty found himself looking up at the windows of the second floor. Was that a curtain moving, or just his imagination? The distance was too great to be certain, but he had the distinct feeling that their secret lessons weren't quite as secret as they'd believed. That evening, as he sat on his porch cleaning his rifle, a habit left over from military service, Dusty reflected on the changes that 2 weeks had brought to all their lives. Henry was becoming stronger and more confident each day. The boy's laughter had returned, along with his natural curiosity and determination. But beyond the physical improvements, something deeper was healing. The part of Henry that had defined himself as broken was beginning to remember that limitations and possibilities weren't the same thing. For Dusty himself, these lessons had awakened something he'd thought permanently lost. The satisfaction of teaching, of watching someone discover their own capabilities, of being useful in ways that extended beyond his own survival. These feelings connected him to the man he'd been before. War and loss had carved away so much of his faith in the future. And somewhere in the mansion above, a mother was learning that watching her son heal might be more important than protecting him from every possible harm. Even if that realization came with its own terrible fears about what she might have to risk to help him continue growing into the person he was meant to become. 3 weeks into their secret lessons, Henry had progressed far beyond what Dusty had thought possible. The boy's natural talent, dormant but never truly lost, had reasserted itself with remarkable speed. He could mount Whisper with minimal assistance, maintain his balance through extended walking sessions, and had even managed brief periods of trotting while Dusty jogged alongside. But with progress came new challenges, and Henry's growing confidence was beginning to manifest in ways that concerned his teacher. "I want to try cantering," Henry announced one morning as Dusty helped him into the saddle. "Thunder and I used to canter across the meadow behind the house. I remember how it felt like flying." Dusty's hands stilled on the saddle straps. "Cantering is different from trotting, Henry. It requires balance and strength that you think I don't have." Henry interrupted, his jaw setting with stubborn determination that reminded Dusty powerfully of his own son. "But I do have it. I can feel it coming back, a little more each day." "This isn't about what you can or can't do," Dusty said carefully. "It's about being smart, taking our time, building your abilities gradually so they last." But Henry's eyes had already taken on the distant look of someone imagining himself somewhere else. Someone else. "Papa always said I was a natural rider. He said some people are born to the saddle, and no amount of training can give you what comes naturally." The longing in the boy's voice was heartbreaking, but Dusty recognized the dangerous edge of someone pushing too hard, too fast. He'd seen it in young soldiers eager to prove themselves, in horses that fought their training rather than accepting it. The results were rarely good. "Your papa was right about your natural ability," Dusty said, checking Whisper's bridle one more time. "But he also knew that natural ability has to be combined with good judgment. Even the best riders in the world started with walking, then trotting, then everything else that came after." Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the mansion. Voices carried across the morning air, Miss Catherine's crisp tones mixing with deeper, more authoritative sounds. Through the trees that bordered the estate, Dusty could see a black carriage pulling up the curved drive, its brass fittings gleaming in the morning sun. "That's Dr. Whitman's carriage," Henry said, his excitement about cantering immediately replaced by anxiety. "He only comes when Mama is having one of her bad days." Dusty had heard about Margaret's occasional episodes from Miss Catherine's carefully neutral reports. Days when the weight of grief and isolation became too much, when she couldn't leave her room or speak to anyone, when the mansion fell into hushed whispers and worried glances. He'd assumed they were rare occurrences, but the fear in Henry's voice suggested they might be more frequent than anyone admitted. "Should we end today's lesson?" Dusty asked gently. Henry shook his head firmly. "No. Mama's bad days last for hours, sometimes all day. Miss Catherine will be busy taking care of her. And Dr. Whitman will want to examine me too, he always does when he comes. This might be our only chance to practice today." Despite his concerns about Henry's eagerness to advance too quickly, Dusty found himself agreeing to continue. The boy's assessment was probably accurate, and missing a day might set back the momentum they'd worked so hard to build. But he made a mental note to be extra cautious, to keep their session shorter than usual. As they worked through their familiar routine, Dusty noticed something that had been developing gradually over the past week. Henry had begun leaving small items near the corral, a wild flower picked from the garden, a smooth stone from the path, once even a piece of hard candy wrapped in paper. At first, Dusty had assumed the boy was simply being careless, but the items were always placed too deliberately, too carefully arranged to be accidental. "Henry," Dusty said during a rest break, "have you been leaving gifts by the fence?" The boy's cheeks reddened. "Not gifts exactly, just things I thought someone might like, someone who might be watching." The implications of that statement hit Dusty like a physical blow. "You know someone's been watching us." "I think so," Henry said quietly. "Sometimes I see movement in Mama's study window or shadows in the upstairs hallway. And yesterday, when we finished our lesson, there was a white handkerchief on the garden bench, one that smelled like Mama's lavender water." Dusty felt his world shift slightly. If Margaret had been watching their lessons, if she knew what was happening and hadn't stopped it, what did that mean? Was she simply gathering evidence to have him dismissed? Or was something more complex at work? "Are you afraid?" Dusty asked. "Afraid of what might happen if she reveals our secret?" Henry considered the question seriously. "I used to be afraid of everything after the accident. Afraid of falling, afraid of trying, afraid of hoping for things that might not happen. But riding with you has taught me something. Papa used to say that being afraid and being brave can happen at the same time. The brave part is doing what matters, even when you're scared." The wisdom in those words, coming from a 10-year-old boy, reminded Dusty why he'd been drawn to teaching in the first place. Children often understood fundamental truths that adults spent years complicating with doubt and overthinking. Their session continued with renewed focus, Henry's seat improving with each circuit of the corral. But Dusty found himself glancing frequently toward the mansion, wondering about the woman who might be watching from behind those curtained windows. What did she see when she looked at her son? Did she recognize the transformation that had been taking place, the return of confidence and joy that riding had brought to Henry's life? As they prepared to end the lesson, Henry made an announcement that sent ice through Dusty's veins. "I've been thinking about what you said, about taking things slowly," the boy said as Dusty helped him dismount, "and I've decided that tomorrow I want to try riding without the modified saddle, just a regular saddle, like I used to use with Thunder." "Henry, that's not—" "I know it's more dangerous," Henry interrupted, "but I also know I'm strong enough now. My balance is good, my legs are getting steadier every day, and Whisper trusts me completely. I need to know if I can really ride again, or if I'm just playing at it with special equipment." Dusty looked into the boy's determined face and saw echoes of his own son's stubborn courage, the kind that led to both great achievements and terrible disasters. The line between supporting someone's growth and enabling their recklessness was thinner than most people realized, and Dusty wasn't sure which side of it Henry's request fell on. "We'll talk about it tomorrow," he said finally. "After you've had time to think about whether proving something to yourself is worth risking everything we've built together." As Henry wheeled away toward the mansion, Dusty remained by the corral, his mind churning with difficult questions. How much risk was acceptable in the name of progress? How could he balance Henry's need to challenge himself against the very real dangers that came with that challenge? And what would happen when Margaret, assuming she had been watching, decided to step out of the shadows and into their carefully constructed world of secret healing? The answers to those questions would come sooner than any of them expected, but for now, Dusty could only prepare for a conversation that might determine whether their fragile progress would continue or whether outside forces would bring their small miracle to an abrupt and possibly painful end. The following morning brought an unseasonable chill that made Whisper's breath visible in small puffs as Dusty prepared for what he sensed would be a pivotal lesson. Henry arrived earlier than usual, his face set with the kind of determination that could lead either to breakthrough or disaster. Beside his chair sat a regular riding saddle, his father's, by the look of its fine leather and silver fittings. "I brought Papa's saddle," Henry announced without preamble. "Miss Catherine thinks I'm having it cleaned and oiled as a memorial project. She doesn't know I plan to use it." Dusty examined the saddle, running his weathered hands over leather that had been lovingly maintained despite its owner's death. It was beautiful work, expensive and well-crafted, but it lacked all the modifications he'd built into Henry's current equipment. The extra support, the securing straps, the safety features that had made their lessons possible. "Henry," Dusty began carefully, "this saddle was made for someone with full use of their legs. Without the modifications. Without the modifications, I'll know if I'm really riding or just pretending." Henry interrupted. "I need to know, Mr. Hayes. I need to understand what's actually possible for me." The boy's eyes held an intensity that reminded Dusty uncomfortably of his own son in the weeks before the accident that claimed his life. Thomas had possessed the same fierce determination to prove himself, the same impatience with anything that felt like limitation or protection. The memory made Dusty's hands shake slightly as he lifted the saddle. "We'll try it," he said finally, "but with conditions. No faster than a walk until I'm certain you're secure. And at the first sign of trouble, we go back to your modified equipment." Henry's smile was radiant. "I promise." As Dusty saddled Whisper with the traditional tack, he noticed something that made his breath catch. Tucked beneath the saddle's stirrup leather was a small, folded paper. He palmed it quickly, waiting until Henry was distracted by greeting Whisper before unfolding it. The handwriting was elegant, feminine. "Please be careful with him. He is all I have left. M.C." Margaret had not only been watching, she'd been close enough to leave a note, to touch her late husband's saddle, to acknowledge what was happening between her son and the weathered cowboy she'd entrusted with something precious beyond measure. The weight of that trust settled on Dusty's shoulders like lead. Mounting proved more challenging than either of them had anticipated. Without the modified saddle's supports, Henry had to rely entirely on his upper body strength and balance. It took 3 attempts. and by the time he was seated, both of them were breathing hard. "How does it feel?" Dusty asked, keeping one hand on Whisper's bridle and the other ready to steady Henry if needed. "Different," Henry admitted, his voice tight with concentration. "I can feel how much more I have to work to stay balanced, but it feels real, like I'm actually riding instead of just sitting on a horse." They began with simple exercises, Henry adjusting his position, finding his balance point, learning to trust his seat without the additional security he'd grown accustomed to. Whisper seemed to sense the increased difficulty, moving with even more care than usual, her steps deliberate and steady. But it was during their first attempt at walking that the lesson took an unexpected turn. As Whisper began to move, Henry's left leg, the one with less sensation, slipped from its position. Without the securing straps of his modified saddle, there was nothing to keep him centered, except his own strength and balance. For a terrifying moment, he began to slide sideways. Dusty lunged forward, catching the boy before he could fall, but the near accident left both of them shaken. "I'm all right," Henry gasped, though his face was pale and his hands were trembling. "Let me try again." "Absolutely not," Dusty said firmly. "We're done for today. This was too much, too soon." "But I almost had it," Henry protested. If we just keep pushing when you're not ready, you'll get hurt," Dusty said, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "And then all of this, everything we've built together, will be over." As he helped Henry dismount and transfer back to his wheelchair, Dusty couldn't shake the image of what might have happened if he'd been a fraction of a second slower. The boy could have been seriously injured, and the blame would have rested squarely on Dusty's shoulders. But Henry wasn't ready to give up. "What if we compromised?" he suggested as Dusty unsaddled Whisper. "What if I used Papa's saddle, but we added just one safety strap? Not the full modifications, but something to help with balance until I get stronger." Before Dusty could answer, they were interrupted by the sound of voices coming from the direction of the mansion. Miss Catherine's voice was clearly audible, along with a man's deeper tones, Dr. Whitman, most likely, making his rounds after yesterday's visit. "Master Henry should be in the garden about now," Miss Catherine was saying. "He's taken to spending his mornings outdoors lately, quite beneficial for his spirits, I believe." Henry's eyes went wide with panic. "They're coming this way," he whispered. "If they find us here with Papa's saddle." Dusty moved quickly, unsaddling Whisper and stowing the tack while Henry maneuvered his chair away from the corral. But there was no way to completely hide what they'd been doing. Henry's clothes showed signs of his riding attempts, and the regular saddle was distinctive enough that Miss Catherine would recognize it immediately. "Act natural," Dusty murmured. "You came to visit the horses, nothing more." Miss Catherine appeared around the corner first, followed by a distinguished gentleman in a dark coat who could only be Dr. Whitman. The doctor was younger than Dusty had expected, perhaps 40, with the kind of confident bearing that came from years of being treated as an authority on matters of life and death. "There you are, Master Henry," Miss Catherine said, her sharp eyes taking in the scene. "Dr. Whitman wanted to see how you're managing with your outdoor activities." Dr. Whitman approached Henry's chair with professional interest. "Your governess tells me you've been showing remarkable improvement in your general health and spirits. Spending time with the horses, I understand." "Yes, sir," Henry replied, his voice carefully neutral. "I find them calming." "Excellent therapy, Doctor." Whitman nodded approvingly. "Equine therapy has shown promising results for patients with various limitations. Of course, we must be careful not to attempt activities beyond one's capabilities." The doctor's gaze shifted to Dusty, clearly expecting an introduction. Miss Catherine provided it reluctantly. "Dr. Whitman, this is Mr. Hayes, our horse trainer." "Miss Hayes, Dr. Whitman has been caring for the Calloway family since Master Henry's accident." "A pleasure," Dr. Whitman said, extending his hand. "I trust you understand the importance of keeping Master Henry at a safe distance from the animals. Given his condition, any sort of mounted activity would be extremely dangerous." Dusty shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of Margaret's note in his pocket and Henry's desperate hope in the air between them. "I understand the importance of safety, Doctor," and of not giving up on what might still be possible. Dr. Whitman's eyebrows rose slightly at the implied challenge in Dusty's words, but before he could respond, Miss Catherine was directing Henry back toward the mansion. "Come along, Master Henry. Dr. Whitman wants to examine your progress, and we mustn't keep him waiting." As the group moved away, Henry caught Dusty's eye over his shoulder. The look they shared was full of unfinished business, unanswered questions, and the growing certainty that their secret lessons were becoming harder to keep secret with each passing day. That evening, Dusty sat on his porch with Margaret's note in his hands, reading it again and again. "He is all I have left." The words carried a weight of love and terror that he understood completely. But they also suggested something else, that Margaret knew about the risks and was asking him to take them anyway, trusting him with the most precious thing in her world. The question now was whether Dusty was worthy of that trust, and whether he could find a way to help Henry achieve his dreams without destroying them all in the process. The confrontation came 3 days later, not in the way any of them had expected, but with the sudden force of a summer thunderstorm breaking over the plains. Henry had arrived for his morning lesson, carrying more than his usual determination. He brought with him a leather portfolio that he clutched against his chest like armor. "I need to show you something," he announced before Dusty could even greet him properly. "Something I found in Papa's study last night." Dusty helped the boy transfer to a bench beside the corral, noting the fevered excitement in Henry's eyes. Whatever he'd discovered had shaken him profoundly, and Dusty felt a familiar twist of apprehension in his stomach. Henry opened the portfolio with trembling fingers, revealing a legal document written in the formal language of wills and estates. "It's Papa's will," he said quietly. "The real one, not the simplified version Miss Catherine read to me after the funeral." Dusty scanned the pages, his reading skills rusty but adequate enough to understand the implications of what Henry had uncovered. According to the document, Henry would inherit full control of the Calloway estate upon reaching his 18th birthday. More importantly, he would gain legal authority over all decisions regarding his own care and treatment once he turned 16. "Do you understand what this means?" Henry asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "In 6 years, I'll be able to make my own choices about my life, about my treatment, about whether I want to keep living like an invalid or try to become something more." The revelation hit Dusty like a physical blow. This wasn't just about a boy learning to ride again. This was about preparing for a future where Henry would have the power to determine his own destiny. The weight of that responsibility and the danger of raising false hopes settled on Dusty's shoulders like lead. But before he could respond, they were interrupted by a voice that neither of them had ever heard directed toward them personally. "Henry!" They turned toward the mansion to see Margaret Calloway walking across the garden, her black dress stark against the morning light. She moved with purpose, her chin raised in a way that suggested she'd made a decision that had taken considerable courage to reach. Henry's portfolio slipped from his hands, the legal documents scattering across the bench. "Mama!" he breathed, his voice filled with a mixture of joy and terror. Margaret approached slowly, as if giving them time to absorb the reality of her presence. She was smaller than Dusty had expected, more delicate, but her eyes held a strength that reminded him powerfully of her son's determination. "Mr. Hayes," she said, stopping just close enough for conversation, but far enough away to maintain some semblance of propriety. "I believe we need to talk." Dusty stood, instinctively removing his hat. "Mrs. Calloway, you've been teaching my son to ride," she said simply. It wasn't a question or an accusation, just a statement of fact delivered in a voice that revealed nothing of her intentions. "Yes, ma'am," Dusty replied, seeing no point in denial. Margaret's gaze shifted to Henry, and for a moment her composed facade cracked slightly. "You look well," she said softly. "Stronger than I've seen you since." She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "Since the accident," Henry completed quietly. "Mama, Mr. Hayes has been helping me remember what it feels like to be myself again." Margaret's eyes filled with tears that she fought to control. "I know. I've been watching." The admission hung between them like a bridge that could either connect their separate worlds or collapse under the weight of what it represented. Dusty found himself holding his breath, waiting to see which direction the conversation would turn. "I need to understand something," Margaret continued, addressing Dusty directly. "Why? Why risk your position, your reputation, everything for a boy you barely know?" Dusty considered his answer carefully, knowing that whatever he said would determine not just his own future but Henry's as well. "Because," he said finally, "I lost my own son to an accident. I couldn't save him, couldn't teach him everything I wanted him to know, couldn't be the father he deserved. Maybe helping Henry can't bring Thomas back, but it can honor what we might have had together." Margaret's composure finally broke completely. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she sank onto the bench beside her son, her hands shaking as she reached for his face. "I've been so afraid," she whispered, "so terrified of losing you too that I forgot you were already slipping away from me. I thought if I kept you safe, kept you protected from every possible harm, I could prevent another tragedy. But I was wrong, wasn't I? I was slowly killing the part of you that made you who you are." Henry leaned into his mother's touch, his own tears flowing freely. "I thought you were ashamed of me. I thought you couldn't bear to look at what I'd become." "Oh, my darling boy," Margaret sobbed. "I was ashamed of myself. Ashamed that I couldn't fix you, couldn't make the doctors wrong, couldn't be brave enough to hope that you might still have a future worth living." Dusty started to step away, feeling like an intruder on this private moment of reconciliation, but Margaret's voice stopped him. "Don't go," she said, wiping her eyes with a lace handkerchief. "I have something to tell you both, something I should have shared long ago." She took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. "James Henry's father didn't die from illness, as we told everyone. He died in a riding accident, the same kind of accident that injured Henry, the same kind that took your son, Mr. Hayes." The revelation hit both Henry and Dusty like lightning. Henry's face went white with shock, while Dusty felt the familiar twist of grief mixed with understanding. "Papa died riding?" Henry whispered. Margaret nodded painfully. "He was trying to break a new stallion, against everyone's advice. The horse threw him, and he struck his head on a rock. He never regained consciousness." She looked directly at her son. "When your accident happened, when you were thrown from thunder, I thought I was being punished for not stopping your father from taking that risk. I swore I would never let you face that danger again." "But Papa would have wanted me to keep riding," Henry said with sudden certainty. "He would have understood that some risks are worth taking." "Yes," Margaret admitted, "he would have. James believed that living in fear was worse than the fear itself. He used to say that horses taught us about courage, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it." She turned to Dusty, her eyes holding a mixture of gratitude and desperate hope. "I've been watching you teach my son, Mr. Hayes. I've seen him become himself again, seen him remember what it means to have dreams and goals and reasons to wake up in the morning. What you've given him is precious beyond measure." "But," Dusty prompted, sensing there was more to come. "But I need to know that you understand what we're really doing here. This isn't just about teaching a disabled boy to ride. This is about preparing him for a life where he'll have to make his own choices about risk and safety and what he's willing to sacrifice for his dreams." She gestured toward the scattered legal documents. "Henry showed you his father's will. In 6 years, he'll control his own destiny. What we teach him now, what we help him believe about himself and his capabilities, will determine whether he uses that freedom wisely or recklessly." Dusty looked from mother to son, seeing the family resemblance not just in their features, but in their shared determination to face hard truths honestly. "What are you asking of me?" he said quietly. Margaret stood, smoothing her skirts with hands that had stopped shaking. "I'm asking you to continue teaching my son, but not in secret anymore. I'm asking you to help me learn what I need to know to support his progress safely. And I'm asking you to help us both understand the difference between protecting him and preparing him. She paused, her voice growing stronger. Most importantly, I'm asking you to teach us both how to be brave enough to hope again, even when hope feels dangerous. The three of them stood in the morning light, each processing the magnitude of what had just been revealed and decided. The secret lessons were over, but something far more significant was just beginning: a partnership between a grieving mother, a determined boy, and a weathered cowboy, who had each found in the others a reason to believe that second chances were possible, even when they came disguised as risks worth taking. The transformation that followed Margaret's decision to join their lessons was nothing short of remarkable. Within days, the entire dynamic of the Calloway estate had shifted from one of careful isolation to purposeful collaboration. Margaret proved to be not just a willing student, but a natural horsewoman whose skills had been dormant, rather than lost, during her years of grief. "I haven't ridden since James died," she confessed on her third morning in the corral, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her riding habit. A deep blue ensemble that she'd had altered to accommodate morning propriety while still allowing for practical movement. "I was afraid I'd forgotten everything." "Riding isn't something you forget," Dusty assured her, watching as she approached one of the gentler mares with a mixture of longing and trepidation. "It's like breathing or walking. The body remembers even when the mind has doubts." Henry watched from his position on Whisper, his face glowing with joy at seeing his mother preparing to mount a horse for the first time in his memory. "Mama, you look beautiful," he said simply, and Margaret's smile in response was the first genuinely happy expression Dusty had seen from her. But it wasn't just the riding lessons that had changed. Margaret had pulled a blue ribbon from her old riding coat, a first-place award from her youth competitions that she'd kept hidden away, like so many other reminders of happier times. She'd shown it to Henry with obvious pride, telling him stories of her competitive days that revealed a side of her personality that grief had buried but not destroyed. "I was quite accomplished in my day," she said, running her fingers over the faded silk. "Your father used to joke that he fell in love with my horsemanship before he noticed my face." "What made you stop competing?" Henry asked. Margaret's expression grew thoughtful. "Marriage, motherhood, the responsibilities of running an estate. I told myself those things mattered more than my own ambitions. Perhaps they did, but I wonder sometimes if I gave up too much of myself in the process." Their conversations during breaks in the lessons revealed the depth of change happening within the family. Margaret began sharing memories of James that she'd kept locked away, stories that painted him as a man who'd believed deeply in taking calculated risks for meaningful rewards. "Your father once said that the purpose of wealth was to give us the freedom to take chances that mattered," she told Henry as they watched Dusty work with a spirited gelding. He wasn't reckless, but he understood that some opportunities only come to those brave enough to reach for them. These revelations were leading them toward a decision that both thrilled and terrified all three of them. The town's annual harvest festival was approaching, a week-long celebration that culminated in various competitions and demonstrations. Margaret had mentioned, almost casually, that the festival traditionally included a riding exhibition where local horsemen showed off their skills. "It might be meaningful," she'd suggested one morning, "for people to see that limitations don't always mean what we think they mean." The idea had taken root in Henry's imagination with the force of a revelation. "You mean I could demonstrate what I've learned? Show people that being in a wheelchair doesn't mean giving up on everything?" "I mean," Margaret said carefully, "that you could show them what's possible when people are willing to work together towards something worthwhile." But the path toward such a public demonstration was fraught with challenges that went far beyond the technical aspects of riding. The social implications alone were staggering: a wealthy widow appearing publicly after years of seclusion, her disabled son attempting feats that medical authority had declared impossible, all in partnership with a working-class cowboy whose own reputation was built more on competence than social standing. Dr. Whitman had been the first to voice his objections when word of their collaboration inevitably reached him through Miss Catherine's careful reports. Mrs. Calloway, he'd said during his next visit, his voice heavy with professional concern, I must strongly advise against any public display that might raise false hopes about Master Henry's condition. The disappointment, should he fail or injure himself, could set back his emotional recovery significantly. Margaret had listened politely, then replied with a steel in her voice that surprised everyone present. Dr. Whitman, I appreciate your concern for my son's well-being, but I've spent 2 years following medical advice about limitation and protection, and I've watched him grow smaller and sadder with each passing month. Perhaps it's time to try a different approach. The town's reaction was equally mixed. Some viewed Margaret's emergence from seclusion as a positive development, a sign that the Calloway family was finally healing from their tragedies. Others whispered about propriety and the wisdom of a grieving woman making decisions that might endanger her only remaining family member. Jake Morrison, the ranch foreman, had been particularly vocal in his concerns. Mrs. Calloway, he'd said during one of his increasingly frequent visits to the corral, the men are talking. They're worried about liability, about what happens if something goes wrong during this demonstration. The estate could face serious consequences. The estate has faced serious consequences for the past 2 years, Margaret had replied calmly. Perhaps it's time to face some different ones. But beyond the external pressures, there were internal challenges that tested all 3 of them daily. Henry's progress, while remarkable, was still fragile. He could ride confidently at a walk and maintain his balance through gentle trotting, but the kind of demonstration that would truly capture public attention required skills that pushed the boundaries of his current abilities. Margaret, despite her returning confidence on horseback, struggled with moments of paralyzing fear when she watched her son attempt anything that reminded her of the risks that had claimed her husband. More than once, Dusty had seen her grip the fence rail until her knuckles turned white, fighting the urge to call a halt to exercises that were well within Henry's capabilities. For Dusty himself, the pressure of preparation brought back memories of military campaigns where the stakes were life and death. He found himself checking and rechecking equipment, planning for every possible contingency, losing sleep over details that might mean the difference between triumph and disaster. I keep thinking about Thomas, he confessed to Margaret one evening as they watched Henry practice mounting and dismounting independently, about all the ways I failed to protect him, all the chances I had to say no to risks that seemed reasonable at the time. Margaret's hand found his arm, her touch gentle but firm. The difference, she said quietly, is that this time you're not facing those risks alone. Henry has both of us watching over him, and more importantly, he has the skills and judgment you've taught him to make good decisions for himself. As the festival approached, their practice sessions became more intensive and more focused. They developed a routine that showcased Henry's abilities while maintaining reasonable safety margins, a series of riding patterns that demonstrated balance, control, and partnership between horse and rider. Margaret would participate alongside her son, showing that their family's connection to horses hadn't been broken by tragedy, but rather transformed by it. The town's excitement about the demonstration grew daily, fed by stories of the remarkable progress Henry had made and the dramatic change in his mother's demeanor. Merchants began advertising special festival attractions, and visitors from neighboring towns started making plans to attend what was being billed as an extraordinary display of courage and determination. But with 3 days remaining before the festival, an unexpected complication arose that threatened to derail everything they'd worked toward. Miss Catherine received a letter from the Territorial Medical Board, apparently prompted by Dr. Whitman's concerns about the public demonstration. The letter raised questions about the liability of allowing a disabled minor to participate in what could be construed as a dangerous exhibition. They're threatening to seek an injunction, Miss Catherine reported during an emergency meeting in the mansion's library. They claim it's a matter of public safety and child protection. Margaret's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. How long do we have? The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If they succeed in obtaining the injunction, Henry won't be permitted to participate in any public riding demonstration. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Everything they'd built together, all the progress Henry had made, his dreams of showing the world what was possible, all of it hung in the balance of a legal proceeding that would be decided by people who'd never seen him ride, never witnessed his transformation, never understood what these lessons had meant to a boy who'd been told his dreams were impossible. "What do we do?" Henry asked quietly, his voice smaller than it had been in weeks. Margaret looked at her son, then at Dusty, her expression resolving into something that reminded him powerfully of her late husband's determination. "We prepare our case," she said firmly, "and we remind them that some things are worth fighting for, especially when the people trying to stop us have never bothered to understand what we're actually fighting for." The battle for Henry's right to demonstrate his abilities was about to begin, and the outcome would determine not just whether he could ride in the festival, but whether the progress they'd all made together could survive the collision between institutional authority and the stubborn human belief that limitations were often just unopened doors, waiting for someone brave enough to turn the handle. The morning of the harvest festival dawned clear and bright, the autumn air crisp with the promise of a perfect day for outdoor celebrations. But beneath the festive atmosphere that was already building in town, tension crackled like electricity before a storm. The legal hearing had been resolved in their favor. Margaret's testimony about Henry's remarkable progress, combined with Dusty's detailed safety protocols and even Miss Catherine's reluctant support, had convinced the territorial judge that the demonstration posed no undue risk to public safety or the boys' well-being. Now, as families began arriving at the festival grounds with their picnic baskets and carnival expectations, the Calloway family faced their moment of truth. The festival banner, stretched across Main Street, proclaimed "Celebrating Community, Courage, and New Beginnings," words that seemed written specifically for what they were about to attempt. Henry sat in his wheelchair near the demonstration ring, his father's riding clothes altered to fit his smaller frame, his face a mixture of excitement and nervous energy that reminded Dusty powerfully of soldiers before their first battle. But this was a different kind of courage being tested, not the courage to face death, but the courage to face life with all its possibilities and disappointments. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked, kneeling beside her son's chair and adjusting his jacket with the kind of maternal attention that had been absent from their lives for too long. "Like I'm about to fly," Henry replied honestly, "and like I might fall, both at the same time." Margaret smiled, understanding exactly what he meant. "That's what your father used to say before every important ride, that the best moments in life happened when you felt like you were balanced on the edge between soaring and falling." The crowd was larger than any of them had expected. Word of Henry's story had spread throughout the territory, drawing visitors from neighboring towns who came to witness what some called a miracle, and others viewed with skeptical curiosity. Dusty could feel their eyes on him as he prepared. Whisper for the demonstration, could hear the whispered conversations that ranged from admiration to doubt. "That's the cowboy who's been teaching the Calloway boy," someone murmured. "Some say he's got a special touch with horses and healing. Others say he's filling that child's head with dangerous dreams," came the reply. "We'll see which one's true soon enough." Dr. Whitman stood near the front of the crowd, his presence a reminder of the medical establishment's skepticism about what they were attempting. But beside him, somewhat to Dusty's surprise, stood several other families with disabled children, parents who had traveled considerable distances for the hope of seeing possibilities they'd been told didn't exist. The festival's master of ceremonies, a jovial merchant named Samuel Hutchins, raised his voice to address the gathered crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are honored today to witness a demonstration of horsemanship that speaks to the very best of human determination and family devotion. The Calloway family has shown us that love, patience, and skillful teaching can overcome obstacles that once seemed insurmountable. As the crowd settled into expectant silence, Dusty felt the weight of every eye upon them. This wasn't just about proving Henry could ride, it was about challenging assumptions that had governed how society viewed disability, limitation, and the boundaries of human potential. Henry transferred from his wheelchair to Whisper with the smooth confidence that weeks of practice had developed. The modified saddle they'd agreed to use for the demonstration provided some additional security while still allowing him to display genuine riding skill. As he settled into position, his entire posture transformed from that of a disabled child to that of a natural horseman. The crowd's murmur of appreciation was audible as Henry took up the reins and nodded to Dusty that he was ready. Whisper, as if sensing the importance of the moment, stood perfectly still until Henry's gentle pressure signaled their first movement. They began with simple walking patterns, Henry guiding Whisper through figure eights and serpentines that demonstrated his control and balance. The crowd watched in amazed silence as the boy, who had been confined to a wheelchair for 2 years, displayed horsemanship that many able-bodied riders would have envied. "Look at his seat," someone called out admiringly. "He's riding like he was born to it." "The horse trusts him completely," observed another spectator. "You can see it in the way she responds to his signals." As their confidence built, Henry attempted more challenging maneuvers, gentle direction changes, backing up, side passing. Each successful movement drew appreciative murmurs from the crowd and visible emotion from Margaret, who watched with tears streaming down her face as her son displayed skills she'd feared were lost forever. But the most powerful moment came when Henry brought Whisper to a stop in the center of the ring and addressed the crowd directly, his young voice carrying clearly across the festival grounds. "2 years ago, doctors told my family I would never ride again," he said, his words causing a hush to fall over the assembled spectators. "They said my back was too damaged, my legs too weak, my chances too small to hope for something like this." He paused, his gaze finding his mother's face in the crowd, then Dusty's encouraging nod. "They were wrong about what's possible when people believe in you and you believe in yourself." The crowd's response to Henry's words was immediate and profound. Applause erupted from every corner of the festival grounds, but it wasn't the polite appreciation typically offered at public demonstrations. This was something deeper, more emotional, the sound of people witnessing courage in its purest form. "Now," Henry continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I want to show you what's really possible when someone believes that limitations aren't the same as endings." He guided Whisper into a trot, maintaining perfect balance as the mare's gait quickened. The crowd gasped collectively as Henry rose slightly in his stirrups, demonstrating the leg strength and core stability that months of careful training had developed. For someone who had been told he would never walk again, the sight of him posting to the trot was nothing short of miraculous. But the true climax of the demonstration was yet to come. Margaret had spent the morning preparing her own horse, a spirited bay gelding named Courage that she hadn't ridden since her husband's death. Now, as Henry completed his solo routine, she emerged from behind the demonstration ring mounted and ready to join her son. The sight of Margaret Calloway on horseback sent a ripple of amazement through the crowd. Many of these people remembered her from before her self-imposed isolation, recalled stories of her competitive riding days, but seeing her now dressed in deep blue riding attire, her posture erect and confident, her face radiant with pride and determination, was like witnessing a resurrection. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had found her strength again, "may I present my son, Henry Calloway, not as a patient or a victim, but as a horseman in his own right." Mother and son guided their horses toward each other in the center of the ring, and what followed was a display of synchronized riding that left the audience breathless. They moved as partners, their horses responding to subtle signals as Henry and Margaret executed a series of coordinated maneuvers that showcased not just individual skill, but the deep bond that had been restored between them. As they rode side by side, matching each other's pace and direction with perfect timing, Dusty felt tears running down his own weathered cheeks. This was what he'd envisioned in his most optimistic moments, not just Henry riding again, but a family healed, a mother and son reconnected through their shared love of horses and their mutual courage to hope again. The crowd was on its feet now, cheering with an enthusiasm that spoke to something primal and universal, the human need to witness triumph over adversity, to see limitations challenged and overcome. Even Dr. Whitman was applauding, his professional skepticism overwhelmed by the undeniable evidence of what he was witnessing. But the most meaningful moment came when Dusty approached the center of the ring, and Henry called out to him with a voice full of gratitude and joy. "Mr. Hayes," Henry said, bringing Whisper to a stop beside where Dusty stood, "would you like to join us?" Without hesitation, Dusty mounted his own horse and rode into the ring, completing a triangle of partnership that represented far more than just three people sharing a moment of triumph. It was a symbol of how healing happened, not in isolation, but through connection, not through protection from risk, but through the careful acceptance of meaningful challenges. As the three of them rode together, the crowd's cheers grew even louder. Children in the audience pointed with wonder at Henry, while their parents wiped away tears and whispered to each other about possibilities they'd never considered. The families with disabled children who had traveled to witness this demonstration pressed closer to the ring, their faces shining with hope and determination. The demonstration concluded with Henry dismounting independently, transferring smoothly back to his wheelchair and addressing the crowd one final time. "6 months ago," he said, his voice steady and clear, "I thought my life was over. I thought being paralyzed meant giving up on everything that mattered to me. Today, I've learned that sometimes the most important journeys aren't about where your legs can take you, but where your heart is brave enough to go." He gestured toward his mother and Dusty. "I've also learned that healing isn't something that happens to you. It's something that happens between people who refuse to accept that limitations are permanent." As Henry spoke these final words, Dusty reached into his pocket and pulled out a small leather case. Inside were a pair of silver riding spurs, not his own, but ones he'd had crafted specifically for this moment. Sized to fit Henry's boots and engraved with a simple inscription, "For courage in all its forms." These belonged to a young rider who understood that bravery isn't the absence of fear, Dusty said, presenting the spurs to Henry. "They're meant for someone who chooses to ride forward despite the fear, who believes that dreams are worth the risks they require." As Henry accepted the spurs with trembling hands, the crowd erupted in the loudest applause of the entire demonstration. In that moment, surrounded by the cheers of hundreds of people who had witnessed something extraordinary, three individuals who had found each other across the distances of grief, disability, and social boundaries understood that they had achieved something that would echo far beyond this single day. They had proven that limitations were often just unopened doors, and that the right combination of courage, patience, and love could turn any key. 6 months after the Harvest Festival demonstration that had transformed 3 lives and touched an entire community, the Calloway estate bore little resemblance to the isolated, grief-stricken place it had been. Where once there had been silence and careful limitations, now there was laughter, purposeful activity, and the daily sounds of horses and riders working together toward goals that extended far beyond individual healing. Henry's progress had continued at a pace that amazed even Dusty. The boy, who had been confined to a wheelchair, now spent part of each day on horseback, his strength and confidence growing with each passing week. His medical examinations showed improvements that Dr. Whitman described as unprecedented and medically fascinating, though he was honest enough to admit that his own skepticism had been proven spectacularly wrong. "The muscle development in his core and upper legs is remarkable," Dr. Whitman reported during one of his now welcome visits to the estate. "The riding has strengthened neural pathways that we assumed were permanently damaged." While he may never regain full mobility, he's achieved functional improvements that I would have declared impossible a year ago. But more significant than the physical changes were the transformations in character and purpose that had emerged from their shared journey. Henry had become a young man of quiet confidence and deep empathy, his understanding of limitation and possibility tempered by experience in ways that gave him wisdom beyond his years. Margaret had not only returned to riding, but had embraced a mission that gave new meaning to her considerable resources and social position. The estate had been transformed into an informal therapeutic center where families dealing with disability could come to explore possibilities that traditional medicine often overlooked. She had established partnerships with doctors willing to consider alternative approaches, and the success stories that emerged from their work were beginning to change attitudes throughout the territory. We've had inquiries from as far away as Colorado and California, Margaret told Dusty one afternoon as they watched Henry working with a new student, a young girl named Sarah, whose parents had traveled 300 miles after hearing about Henry's story. Families who had given up hope are beginning to believe that other approaches might be possible. The girl, paralyzed in a buggy accident 6 months earlier, was experiencing her first day on horseback, with a mixture of terror and wonder that Dusty remembered well from Henry's early lessons. But Henry had become a remarkable teacher himself, his gentle voice and patient encouragement, helping Sarah find her balance and confidence in ways that spoke to his own growth. "Remember," Henry was saying, "the horse isn't carrying you, you're partners. She wants to help you succeed, so trust her and trust yourself." For Dusty, the changes had been perhaps the most profound of all. The man who had spent years drinking away memories of loss and failure had found not just purpose, but peace in his role as teacher and mentor. The estate had built him a proper house to replace his rundown cabin, but more importantly, they had given him a place in their lives that honored his skills while healing his heart. His relationship with Margaret had evolved into something that might have surprised them both had they been asked to define it a year earlier. It wasn't romance. Both of them carried too much respect for their lost spouses for that. But it was partnership in the deepest sense, built on shared understanding of loss and mutual commitment to helping others transform their own challenges into strengths. "You saved us," Margaret had told him one evening as they sat on the mansion's porch, watching Henry and Sarah practice mounting techniques under the patient supervision of Whisper and a new gentle mare named Hope. "We saved each other," Dusty had replied, and realized as he spoke that it was the truest thing he'd ever said. The work they were doing had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The territorial government had begun consulting with them about approaches to rehabilitation and disability services. Universities were sending students to observe their methods. Most importantly, other communities were starting their own programs based on what they'd learned from the Callaway Estate's example. But on this particular evening, as autumn returned to the Wyoming plains and the first anniversary of their public demonstration approached, the three original partners in healing were content to sit together and reflect on how far they'd all traveled. Henry, now 11 and visibly stronger, was reading aloud from a letter he'd received from a boy in Kansas, whose family had started riding lessons after hearing Henry's story. Margaret worked on correspondence with families seeking guidance for their own situations. Dusty whittled a wooden horse for Sarah, whose own progress was beginning to mirror Henry's early breakthroughs. On the mantelpiece sat a new family photograph, not a formal studio portrait, but a candid image taken after the Harvest Festival, showing the three of them on horseback, their faces glowing with joy and accomplishment. It was this image that visitors to the estate saw first, a visual reminder that families could be formed by choice and circumstance, as well as blood, and that healing was something that happened best when people refused to accept that help was impossible. "Do you ever wonder what Papa would think?" Henry asked during a pause in his reading. Margaret looked up from her correspondence, her eyes soft with memory but no longer shadowed by unhealed grief. "I think he would be proud of all of us," she said simply, proud of your courage, proud of my willingness to hope again, and proud that we found Mr. Hayes when we needed him most." Dusty felt the familiar tightness in his throat that came when he thought about the chain of events that had brought them together. "I think," he said carefully, "that your papa and my Thomas would both understand that sometimes the best way to honor the dead is to live fully, to take the risks that matter, and to help others do the same." As the sun set over the Wyoming plains, casting golden light across the land where a lonely cowboy had once broken horses in solitude, three people who had found family in each other continued the quiet work of proving that limitations were often just unopened doors, and that the right combination of courage, patience, and love could turn any key. In the corral, Whisper nickered softly to her companions, as if she too understood that some stories have endings that are really beginnings, and that the best victories are the ones that create possibilities for others to find their own reasons to hope again.